Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of PharSide Folios with your host, Monica Leek, as we talk about books and authors and all things reading, genres, publishing, and all of those fun stuff with authors. And our today's special guest is none other than the amazing Derek Power. He began writing in early 2001, focusing on short stories at that point, and then figured he'd try to do something a little bit longer. And later he came to complete his first novel, the one that we're going to talk about today, Filthy Henry, the Fairy Detective, and that was published in early 2013. And he currently hails from Skerries,
yeah.
Dublin, Ireland. So all the way from across the waters from Dublin comes Derek Power, and this series, the Filthy Henry series, has multiple editions in the series, multiple books within the series. We've got there's a book 5. It was like nearly Christmas. Mortals magically murder generally is enough to get Filthy Henry involved in the case, but then those murders happened on Halloween, and there's even more reason for him to investigate what's going on. So if anybody's going to solve a case, it's going to be our new friend, Filthy Henry. So that's book 5, and we're starting with book 1. So we're going to pick up, this is Library Lovers Month. For those who may not know, that February is Library Lovers Month. And so we're excited to have with us to talk about Filthy Henry, the Fairy Detective, Derek Power. Welcome to the PharSide.
Hey, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here.
All right. So let's, just fill out, who is Derek Power, the author?
Derek Power, the author, is somebody who, back when he was a teenager, wanted to try and get a book on a shelf and to say, I wrote that book and that's my book. So I like I said, I done a lot of short stories when I was younger, and then the idea for Filthy Henry kind of came to me in late 2012, I think. And so I sat down and plotted it out, and I originally went the traditional route, and so I sent it off to agents and I talked to some publishers and stuff. I got some good feedback, but sadly nobody was in the market to take a new unknown on. I think the Kindle had just kind of really taken off in popularity. So like it was like the iPods to the music industry, like they just weren't prepared for it. So one bit of advice that I got from, I think it might have been a publisher I was talking to in Penguin, he actually came and said, like, why don't you try and do an indie publish it and use the Kindle and get it out that way, and you can build up a bit of an audience. So I went down the indie publishing route. So I became an indie author, and it's been great actually, because you've got full control over everything. You can hire your own editor. You can get your covers designed, or you can design your covers yourself. So I kind of do all my own cover designs for the Filthy Henry books. And then because there's like a great indie author community, you get to meet like loads of people just by having random chats with people online, on forums, on Twitter or whatever. So what ended up happening then was I've the 5 Filthy Henry books out, and through kind of Twitter and Facebook, I got talking to other indie authors, and I was invited into some anthologies. So there's actually a Filthy Henry story that's never been published in a Filthy Henry book, but it's in an anthology. And so that was kind of cool. I got to work on that. And then I was involved in another anthology there during COVID. So I got to work with I think it was 7 authors in total. And it's just, it's been a great little adventure that I think teenage me would be quite happy to know that I actually got to go on.
So what brought you kind of into this fantasy genre? Is it tied to like where you're from and your heritage as to that which brought you to fantasy.
Yeah, so Ireland has a long tradition of Celtic myths and legends, and we've got some great stories, but like nobody ever seems to tap into them outside of Ireland. Um, so one of the things I wanted to do was kind of use the I suppose you call it the baseline of our mythological stuff and bring that into a modern setting. So all the Filthy Henry stories, all of the cases that he works, they have fairy creatures from the Celtic myths and legends with modern spins put onto them. And then some of the cases themselves are actual like uh, a total rebooted, reimagined version of the legends that we would have here in Ireland. So one of the things that Filthy Henry would say quite regularly to his partner in the cases, a human called Shelley, is he explains to her all the Celtic myths and legends are actually true, but they have a nugget of truth that the rest of the story then got built around. So it kind of gives me the freedom then to kind of bring in like leprechauns are in his world, but they're not leprechauns that you know from the stories. The nugget of truth is that they have rainbows and they have pots of gold. But then when you go into a Filthy Henry story, it turns out that they actually fund the human banking system by loaning gold to human bankers and stuff like this. So it was kind of just to tap into that, like that wealth of stories and stuff that nobody else seems to really tap into, I felt.
And so, with Filthy Henry being a series, did you know at the first, when you wrote the first story, did you know that it was going to take off into a series of stories, of novels, versus just being like, okay, I'm doing this one book?
So when I was writing the first book, I got the idea for the follow up, and what I decided to do was one of my favorite authors is Terry Pratchett and his Discworld series, and the way he wrote Discworld was you could pick up any of the books in any order, and you got a self-contained story. And if you needed to know something that maybe happened in a previous book, he kind of just dropped that information into the book you were reading. So I wanted to do the same type of thing with Filthy Henry. So each of the books are self-contained cases, and the characters they grow and they have character arcs. And Shelley in particular has gone from being maybe a novice in the fairy world in book one to being a real badass detective of her own right in book five. But like any of the stuff that you need to know prior to the books, I bring that information along and I carry it along with them. So I didn't envision it being maybe a 5 book series, but it's a
Mm-hmm.
5 book series now. I have book 6 and book 7 already plotted out. Um, it's it's not going to be like a Wheel of Time. It's not going to have a definite end, I don't think. I because there's so many Celtic legends that I can pull from to come up with new cases in the modern world. I could probably just keep on going and going and going. So the idea is to keep going and going and going.
Oh, that's awesome. So basically, Filthy Henry can go on until retirement if he ever chooses to retire.
Exactly, yeah, that's kind of the idea.
So, um, as with any great story, you've got the setting plays a key role in kind of telling the story and supporting the characters. So, what is really the significance? You talk of setting it in Dublin. I mean, that's your home, and so you know it well. You know the history and the heritage and the mythology um, very well. So, why was it really important for you to have this particular setting for Filthy Henry stories?
So I wanted to explore different parts of Ireland in general. So the first book happens in Dublin, and the second one does as well. And that's just because like you said, I'm from Dublin. I grew up in Dublin, so I know Dublin quite well. But a lot of uh, the other legends and things they happen all around the country. So for the third one, he actually leaves Dublin and he goes to solve a case in a town called Carlingford, which is up north of Ireland. And that's because that's where the myth is actually based. So one of the jokes that kind of happens throughout the book is Filthy Henry is very much a Dublin born and bred, doesn't really like to leave Dublin kind of person. So anytime a case takes him away from Dublin, he spends most of the time complaining and, oh, I wish I was still in Dublin. Why am I not in Dublin? And that's where Shelley comes in. Shelley acts as kind of like the voice of the audience. She spends most of her time telling Filthy Henry he needs to broaden his horizons. He needs to realize that crimes, particularly magical crimes, happen everywhere and not just in Dublin. So book 3 happened outside of Dublin. Book 4, we go back to Dublin. Book 5 then happened outside of Dublin again. The main thing is that they all happen inside of Ireland. And that's because I have this crazy idea that I might do maybe around book 10, if I ever get to that point, where Filthy Henry actually meets mythological creatures from another country. And he realizes that his magic only works in Ireland. And outside of Ireland, he's not a powerful creature anymore, because his magic is based on the myths of the homeland, so to speak. So that's why they all happen in Ireland at the minute.
And what is it? I mean, Filthy Henry is a interesting character to say the least. But there's just like something about him that throws people off, or that people just can't stand or dislike about him.
Yeah.
What is that thing?
So Filthy Henry has a bit of a chip on his shoulder. He's a half human, half fairy. So he has his dad was a fairy, his mother was a human, and he doesn't really belong in the mortal world, but he also doesn't belong in the fairy world. And in the mortal world, nobody really knows about his fairy heritage, because the fairy side of the stories are hidden from mortals. There's like a magic spell that prevents people from seeing them. But in the fairy side of the world, he's seen as like dirty, as unclean, as filthy, because he's not a full-bred fairy creature. So they don't want anything to do with him either. So he just sees the world as being this thing that's given him a raw deal, and it's out to get him. So in return, he's constantly sarcastic. He always tries to be the smartest person in the room. He doesn't listen to anybody else's advice. And that's where Shelley again comes in. Shelley is meant to be the foil to all of that, because now there's this person that's dependent on Filthy Henry to explain the fairy world, because she's been exposed to it. But she's also nice and kind, and she learns that Filthy Henry might do a con the odd time where he'll charge somebody money to remove a curse, but there was no curse in the first place. It was all in the person's head, but Filthy Henry will still take that money. So with Shelley on the scene now, she kind of starts saying to him, like, well, you're not able to do that anymore. Like, if you take money from the old person, you have to give it back to the old person. And through Shelley, Filthy Henry starts to maybe become a bit nicer, but it's only because of Shelley. And if Shelley was not in the stories, I don't think Filthy Henry would have developed this conscience that he has. She's his Jiminy Cricket to his Pinocchio, so to speak.
So, what is the premise of this particular book, the book 1, without giving away the whole entire story? What is something that you can tell our viewers who are watching live or by replay, the premise of the Filthy Henry, the fairy detective?
So the reason Filthy Henry is tolerated by the fairy world is he fits a need, and that need is if there's ever a crime where human world and fairy world clash. So in the first book, the king of the leprechauns has his crock of gold stolen, which is a very fairy related crime, until they figure out that it was actually stolen by 2 humans. So they need to find somebody who can investigate how humans stole the king of the leprechauns' crock of gold. And the only person they can do that with is Filthy Henry, because he's a half human, half fairy. Now, the king of the leprechauns and Filthy Henry have a history. So the king of the leprechauns is reluctant to actually ask him to do it. Filthy Henry makes him kind of practically beg him to do it. But that's the genesis of the whole first story, was that Shelley is introduced in the first book as well quite early on, because I came up with like a set of rules that my world has to keep. One of them was that children can see fairies, because adults will just go, oh, it's just a imaginary friend that they're talking to. And then as you grow older and become an adult, your brain kind of just goes like, oh yeah, well, they're just imaginary, so I can't see them anymore. So you kind of stop seeing the fairy world. Unless you're a creative person like an artist or a writer, you kind of still get a bit of a glimpse. So Shelley had a talking cat, because in Celtic mythology we had talking cats, because why not? And the cat went missing, and she kind of suspected that maybe the cat was a fairy, and she'd heard about Filthy Henry. So initially she hires him to find her missing cat, but then she ends up helping him solve the case of the leprechaun's stolen crock of gold.
All right. So, how did, Filthy Henry come into this line of work since he was kind of a castaway from both the mortal world and the fairy world? What, led him to this position? Oh, I'm going to be a detective.
So, it's actually something I've never told in a story. So you're getting a bit of juicy insider information here. So Henry's actually he's 100 years old, but he ages slower because of his magical side. So he looks like a man in his 30s. So when he was growing up, he tried to kind of test the boundaries of what he could and couldn't do with his magical abilities. So because he's not a full-blooded fairy, when he casts magic, it takes a toll on his body, and he needs to eat a lot of food to kind of rebuild and replenish his energy levels. And because of that, then he's limited to the types of spells that he can cast. So he has to kind of be very energy conservative, and he has to be very kind of clever and sneaky with the magic that he does cast. So when he tried once to like enrich his life with wealth, there's like this governing body that I just refer to as the rules. And if you break the rules, the universe kind of course corrects. And it can be a simple course correct where you lose your wealth, or it can be a disastrous one where like there's worse consequences to have. So Filthy Henry became aware of these rules, and he decided that because he's the only human fairy half-breed, he is going to act as a kind of defender of making sure that the fairies don't abuse the mortals, and he kind of ensures the rules are always enforced. The reason he became a detective is because there's no fairy police force that he could join, but he likes the sound of being a detective because it involves problem solving and getting one up on somebody who thinks they might be trying to get one up on the rest of the world.
Good. So, as we think about Filthy Henry and his line of work, is there any effort in the series where he looks to change his position, or is he satisfied with the job he has, or does he eventually say, I'm going to get out of this line of work and do something totally different?
So the one thing that Filthy Henry wants above all else is to be a full-blooded fairy. So that gets established quite early on in the series, and it's kind of like the thing he's always looking for a solution to. How do I become a full-blooded fairy? Shelley has asked him from time to time, why do you want to be a full-blood fairy? Why don't you want to be a full-blooded human? And he explains to her that, like, when you can cast a fireball with your hand, why would you give that up to be immortal? So he wants to go fully onto the magical side of things. So he spends most of his time researching ways to maybe make this happen. He's come up with a couple of solutions in the past, but they never pan out for him. But being a detective is the only thing that he wants to keep doing, because it's a subtle enough way for him to police the fairy world without becoming something official, because he also isn't a big fan of clubs or societies or groups that tell people what to do. So his whole thing is basically just protect the mortal world, and to do that, being a detective is it. I did toy with the idea once of maybe making him like a knight or something, like a modern day knight, but it didn't feel right. Being a detective and kind of being a con artist seems to be just more what Filthy Henry is in my head, so I've just kind of stuck with that.
So again, like with a series, a lot of times you see, characters move in and fade out from one book to another book. New characters introduced. You got your plot, twist, and new stories are introduced. So how do you maintain, the consistency with the story and even with character development within the series, so that your readers are fully connected from book one.
Um, so there's the main kind of cast of characters that are in pretty much every book. Filthy Henry, obviously, and then Shelley is also in them. Shelley has to be in them because Shelley's character allows me to explain things to the audience rather than kind of just give big blurbs of text. So if we encounter a new fairy, or if Shelley has a question maybe about why we're suddenly walking on clouds, Filthy Henry can kind of explain it to Shelley, and then that way that's how the reader gets their information about what's going on in the fairy world. Um, then I have a kind of comic relief character called Drew the Druid, and he runs a magical supply shop in Dublin. Now he sells like crystals and herbs and spices to unsuspecting people, telling them that they're magical, but they're actually not. It's just stuff that he does. But he can actually get his hands on proper magical ingredients. So Filthy Henry and Shelley kind of have a love-hate relationship with Drew, where they love to hate him, and he gets bullied by them most of the time. But he appears in every single one of the books as well. And then there's the ancillary characters that crop up from time to time. So they'll jump from, maybe they'll be in the first book and you won't see them for 2 or 3 books, and then they'll be in the next book after that. And that just kind of is dependent on where the plot might be going. So I use the Celtic gods a lot in book 2. And you don't really see them again then until book 5, where you encounter one of them again. And it's just because the story needed a god to be there to explain some stuff. So for my own personal way of doing it, I actually have a huge file where I'm keeping track of all this kind of stuff. So it keeps track of the usual stuff, the characters' likes and dislikes and their ages and things. But then it also has a timeline for me to work off. So like I said, Shelley kind of in book 1, she's very naive. And in book 5, she's a proper full-fledged detective of her own right. And there's things that have happened to her in the other books that have helped her character develop and grow. So I keep that arc information on my own file, because then when I'm plotting the next book, I can just go back and reference and go like, okay, this is the direction I would like to take the character in. And then, like I said, I've written them in such a way that you can kind of pick up any book. Like if you picked up book 3 right now, there are things that have happened in book 1 and 2 to Shelley and Filthy Henry that you need to know about. But I kind of give you like a little bit of an info dump in book 3 that explains that stuff. So it keeps you up to speed without you having to read the full 2 books.
Okay, so you talk about, just your writing journey and your writing process for, those who may be in the, I'm thinking about writing, I've thought about, I've got some ideas, in a file, in a journal, in a notebook, and I want to, write a story, or I want to write a novel of some sort. So tell us about your own, writing process, and how you took those ideas and took that full plunge into writing.
Yeah, cool. So one of the things I learned was drafts are wonderful. Drafts are absolutely amazing. So I was convinced that you had to have the perfect page before you could write the next page. And when I first started writing the Filthy Henry book, I was on page 1 for, I think, the better part of 3 weeks, where I kept on going back and tweaking it and fine tuning it. And then somebody said to me, no, just write a draft. And then you come back and you fix all that stuff in the next draft and the next draft. So I plot out the book entirely on either an A4 pad, or I might do it in a Word doc or something. And it'll be I try to have each chapter have like an event happen that drives the story forward, either character development story or the actual plot itself. Once I have that done, I do a minimum of 500 words every single night. So I write every single day of the year, at least 500 words. And that's, somebody gave me this great bit of advice where you look at a book and there's like 100,000 words in it, and you think, I'm never going to get that written. And you're right, you'll never write 100,000 words in one sitting. But if you write 500 words at least every day, or 1,000 words at least every day, or 2,000 words, you kind of chip away at that 100,000 words until eventually you've written 100,000 words. So every night I write at least 500. Most nights I might actually be really good. I'll get about 1,500 done. Some nights I might struggle and it'll take me 2 or 3 hours to get 500 words written, but that's what I do every single night. And then once draft one is done, I go over it again and I'll start tweaking it. And as I kind of plot out the book and then I'm writing the first draft, sometimes the plot itself might kind of grow a little bit and it might change to where the plot was plotted. So I kind of just take notes in my plot document so that when I get to draft two, I know where I have to patch things up or move things around. Maybe I revealed something sooner or I bring in a new character later. I add all those bits in as well. And then the draft is just keep going with the drafts until I'm happy. Usually I maybe do 7 drafts before I send it off to an editor for a proofread and a spell check and kind of developmental edits and stuff. But it's literally, it's just that. It's just every night do a set a kind of an achievable minimum amount of words you think you can write every day. Just do that every day. Then when you get into your drafts section, I try to edit at least 3 pages when I'm doing my drafts so that I feel like I'm still doing a big, tangible amount of work. And then you keep going until eventually somebody has a great phrase where you never actually get to the end of a draft and say like draft 8, I'm happy. You eventually just kind of give up because you don't think you could do anything more with it. So when you give up on your drafts, it's ready to be handed over to your editor to have them have a look at it then.
Awesome. Do you have any other golden wisdom nuggets for new authors?
Golden wisdom, yeah, that's a great one. So reader groups are great, and if you can get them that they're not your friends and family, like your immediate friends and family, that's always better. Because like my wife would be one of the early readers of all of my stuff. I inflict it on her all the time, and she's brutally honest. Like she doesn't spare my feelings. But in the back of my head, if she comes to me and she says, that was really good, I'm like, you're just saying that because you're my wife. So I don't really believe it. So it's always good if you can get kind of like an advanced reader group where you can give them, and you don't know them too well, so that you can get kind of that honest and blunt stuff. The writing community on Twitter is actually pretty active as well. So I'm usually on that most nights, tweeting away and joining in the conversations and stuff. You'll find people there who say like, hey, look, if you've got a work in progress, I'd be happy to read it and give you some honest feedback and blunt feedback. So, leverage that. That's free. And why not? And then, yeah, like I said, just start writing. Pretty much just do it every day. If you do something 10 times in a row, it becomes habit forming. So if you can just do 10 nights of writing, the 11th night you'll be sitting on the sofa and your brain will be like going, you have to start doing a bit of writing. You've done it for 10 days, you have to do it today, and you just start doing it then, and then that's your fix that you get going.
All right, that is awesome. So for you new and burgeoning authors out there, take your notes down from Derek, because this is going to help you in that process of writing your next great story, or what you've got hanging in a journal or in a file on your laptop. So what is something that you probably learned about yourself through this writing process? You've got, your communities, Twitter community that you're engaged with. You're building your readership. You've got, 5 in a series, the the Filthy Henry series, and then you've got some, other works.
Yeah. So, like I said at the start, I was asked to participate in a couple of anthologies. So I'm in 3 anthologies at the minute. One of them has a Filthy Henry story. One of them is a standalone story about zombie leprechauns, and one of them is part of a shared world anthology where every story tells an overarching plot, but they were written by different authors. And then I also have I tried my hand at writing a sci-fi novel. So I have a sci-fi noir novel called Duplex Tempest, which one of my all-time favorite books is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And I've always wanted to try and write a novel that was like that, like a futuristic detective novel. So I write a lot of detective novels, I'm realizing. Very sci-fi detectives, but that's just the way it goes.
So, Derek, how can our viewers and those who watch by replay, or somebody who finds us by sharing the link, somebody shared the link with them and they're watching this interview and they're, wondering how can they get this book and, follow you or connect with you on social media?
So probably the best place to go to would be my website. So it's powerrights.com. And there I have my social media links, and I also have my books to read link up there. So all of the books are available there. And the great thing about books to read is it doesn't matter what device you read on or where you want to get your physical copies. It'll send you a link to the place that you want to go. So I'm a big fan of books to read. And then my Twitter is up on Power Rights. So people can get me from there.
Well, that is awesome. So we are so excited that you actually took the time out of your busy day or evening, as it is in Dublin, to be with us this afternoon on the East Coast of the United States. So thank you, Derek Power, for spending time with us, and we wish you continued success with Filthy Henry, the Fairy Detective, and the remainder of the series, all the way up to potentially book 10,
potentially book 200.
100 until he decides to retire, if Henry ever decides to retire from his work. So thank you for spending this time with us, and we wish you the best in all of the work you have ahead of yourself, and all the projects you've got coming down the pike.
Thanks for having me. Great time.
All right, so our PharSide viewers, those who are watching live and who'll catch the replay, make sure you stay in tune to the PharSide Coed Book Club Facebook page for more author interviews and posts as we celebrate Library Lovers Month during the month of February. So until next time, many roots, many voices are a part of the infinite story. So plant your seed and have a great and wonderful day.